6 months ago, on May 21st, 2025, two people were fatally shot in DC at an event linked to the Israeli embassy. Within hours, Israel's Prime Minister Netanyahu used that attack to reframe international criticism of Israel's war in Gaza not as political opposition, but as a threat to Jewish safety worldwide. What followed on the days ahead was the most aggressive and deadly rhetorical escalation since this conflict began in October of 23. So within the first few hours and days after that attack in DC, Netanyahu hardened Israel's war aims, recentered Iran as the ultimate antagonist, and publicly signaled that Gaza would remain under full Israeli military control indefinitely. That wasn't a coincidence. Now let's fast forward to today. Phase 2 of the Gaza ceasefire, covering governance, security control, and post-war authority, was scheduled to enter its decisive alignment window this week, just days before Netanyahu's next high-stakes meeting with Donald Trump. But then, Bondi happened. Now, the Bondi beach attack was real, of course. The violence was real. The trauma is real. But politically, it arrived at just the right moment. Because you see, within just a few hours, the conversation has already shifted. What had been focused scrutiny, ceasefire compliance, humanitarian access, post-war governance, has been overtaken by a completely different frame. Anti-Semitism, security for Jewish communities worldwide, and global emergency response procedures. So in the geopolitical world, mid-December is never about summits or speeches. It's more of a hinge week, a decision corridor, the kind where silence matters more than making any overt statements. And also where any delays can become policy into the new year without ever being declared. The Bondi beach attack yesterday acted as an accelerant. Governments all over Europe and the Americas today are acting fast, expanding anti-Semitism task forces, security reviews, and public warnings. And of course, it's still hot on the media news cycle, but Gaza, without anyone saying so, seemed to slip out of focus. Now, ceasefire discourse didn't just disappear, of course, but according to whispers both in Washington and Cairo this morning, it just seems a little less urgent. And arguments that Gaza advocates had prepared suddenly feel a little less compelling for some reason. And then came the escalation. Now, first reported yesterday, just 6 hours after the attack, and confirmed today, Israeli intelligence has already identified and concluded that Iran was behind the Sydney Hanukkah massacre yesterday. An allegation that, if substantiated, would dramatically reframe what began as a domestic terrorism case. But we've heard these allegations before. These accusations didn't come out of nowhere. Because just a few months ago, Australia has already accused Iran of being behind arson attacks on Jewish day schools, an accusation coincidentally also provided to Australia by Israeli intelligence. So naturally, diplomatic ties were immediately severed, Iranian diplomats were immediately expelled, and federal anti-Semitism task forces were immediately established. Each move followed sustained pressure to treat anti-Semitism not as a domestic crime issue, but as a foreign-directed hostility. And this is where a geopolitical strategist pauses, because from a geopolitical standpoint, Iran gains nothing from sponsoring lone wolf anti-Semitic attacks in Western cities. Nothing. These sort of attacks don't advance sanctions relief, something Iran has been politically begging for. They don't improve deterrence, they don't strengthen Iran's negotiating position, they do the opposite. They harden Western public opinion. They validate Israel's threat narratives, and they reliably shift attention away from Gaza every time. Now, that doesn't disprove involvement, but it does make the logic deeply suspect. Because when an explanation consistently produces outcomes favorable to one actor, greater diplomatic latitude, softened scrutiny, delayed obligations, it's reasonable to ask whether the narrative is doing more work than the facts alone. It's also worth noticing what isn't being debated. After mass shootings, we always seem to argue endlessly. Is it a hate crime? Do we need more guns or less guns? Do we have a mental health problem? Is it the antipsychotics? Or is it the Adderall? Maybe it's just trans people. Now, don't get me wrong, yesterday was a massacre, and hatred of any form can snowball. But it does seem that whenever the victim has a Itishen Nashama or even just Jewish adjacent, there's never any ambiguity. The lone act becomes the collective. The threat becomes civilizational. The act, no matter its severity, suddenly becomes representative of the US's entire 340 million population or Australia's entire 30 million population, even if the attacker has a profile very different from the majority of the country's citizens. But we've seen this pattern before, and we know how it plays out. After the May shooting in DC, pressure on Israel eased, Gaza receded, and Iran moved back to the center of the story. It's not a conspiracy, it's just the structure. Real events occur, systems react. Security displaces accountability. And commitments don't need to be canceled, they just become a little bit more complicated. And by the time leaders meet behind closed doors, the window has already narrowed. In geopolitics, intent matters less than alignment. Because evidently, the most effective catalyst is simply the one that shows up right on schedule.